All right, if you would, open up to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. You may have noticed a handout that's on the tables. If you didn't get one, you can probably look around and find one at an empty seat. One side, of course, has the text of Genesis chapter 1, and the highlights are the Hebrew word bara, which means to create from nothing, forming something out of nothing. And then you'll notice also the Hebrew word Asah, which literally means to made or make, is in the text. I have it bolded and underlined, both of which, and that is that term. Now, there are other phrases that are just underlined, so don't get those confused. But we'll use that tonight. And on the flip side, you got the 6 days of creation. And so you can kind of just use that as a generalities as we go through tonight. We won't refer to it a whole lot until we get to one point. But just kind of keep that in mind, and that's what that's for, just as kind of a help. And if you're listening online, the links to these PDFs are in the description of the YouTube channel that's for tonight's video. So keep that in mind. You can actually print those off at home. In Genesis chapter 1, we talked about last week the things that were before the foundation of the world, that God already had in mind, already knew that Jesus was going to die, and by his blood we would be bought back. He already knew that in Jesus every spiritual blessing would be found. He already had it planned out and foreknown about these things together. Even before the foundation of the world, God loved his Son, sacrificed for him, as well as there was a glory that Jesus had, or the Word had, before he came and put on flesh to be on earth. And understanding these things kind of in the background, that whenever we start the book of Genesis, it is not the beginning of everything. It is only the beginning of this heavens and this earth, what is created by God and his Son. Now, kind of putting these things together, I want you to look down at verse 3. And I want you to notice a couple of things as we go through. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Just that simple. You think in terms, we're going to notice a phrase that's going to show up over and over tonight. And it's going to be this phrase, "and it was so." And you're going to see it about 5 different times as we go. But from the beginning, it's just, let there be light. God's word, and to go, and there was light. Just that simple, yet at the same time, just that awe-inspiring in terms of saying, who can just say something and have creation respond? Maybe you think in terms of what God is controlling here, in terms of protons, neutrons, electrons, atoms, whatever kind of terminology you want to think about, causing them to come into being, causing them to come together in just the way that he desires. And as you think about that, maybe you think about in terms of maybe the story of Jesus in John chapter 2, whenever, if you remember at the wedding feast in Cana, the wine has run out, his mother says, basically, do something. Jesus says, it's not my hour. And yet, out of honor for his mother, he turns water into wine. And to think, that's what every winemaker wishes they could do, because it eliminates the aspect of having to actually grow the fruit, actually having to take the time to add the preservatives or additives to it, the yeast, and actually having to go beyond time. And you realize, here's Jesus just in a moment. He doesn't even really say anything. He just says, all right, now go draw the water out. You realize, all of a sudden, things just change, because that's the power of Jesus. You come back here and look in these terms and go, God just says, let there be light, and there was light. That sounds so simple, and yet at the same time, the next time you stand in a dark room, just say, let there be light, and see what changes. We think, oh, we have some kind of technology that'll turn this thing on. It doesn't work half the time. And you realize, here's God. He just makes the statement. Look at the rest of what's said here. Verse 4. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So you take a special note. God sees the light, and he recognizes this is good. And when he talks about what's good, it's about flourishing, it's about working together in harmony, working together in terms of functioning together. And if you notice, the whole purpose of letting light come was to do what? Look at what he says. Separate the light from the darkness. He says, the reason I'm making light is to separate it from darkness. He says, they're not going to coexist. Now, here we are on earth now, after all these days of creation, And typically the moments that we like are the sunrise and the sunset, because it's the mixture of day and night, also known as twilight, the two lights, right? So here's God saying, here's light, and I'm doing this to separate it from the darkness. Then he continues on, verse 5. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Still the same now? Don't we still call the darkness night? And don't we still call the light day? Ever wondered, who made that call? God did, and we're still going by it to this day. And then he says, and there was evening and there was morning one day. Now you think about it in those terms. Evening and morning. Now this is the little Jewish secret from day one. How do Jews count time, and what is the beginning of a Jewish day? They begin their day at sunset, and it goes all the way around. They go through the darkness first, and then the light, and then whenever the sun sets again, that's the end of the day, right? If you've ever wondered, why do they count time darkness first and then light? Because that's day one. And so it started with darkness. God said, let there be light. And then whenever, it points out here, there was evening and there was morning one day. That's usually not the way we think about counting time nowadays. We think about from midnight to midnight. But if you notice what's in place here, that's why whenever you see these things about the Jews, I mean, the Sabbath ends whenever after the sun has set and it's darkness again. They go, okay, now it's a new day. So just realize those things go all the way back to the very first day of creation. Then look at verse 6, the beginning of day 2. Then God said, you're going to notice those statements over and over again. God's going to make a statement. Look at what he says. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. Now, from the first 2 verses of the chapter, the picture is, here's God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the idea the earth is completely enclosed in water. And that idea comes in terms of this. Here's water all the way around it. If you remember, the Spirit hovered over the surface of the deep and over the surface of the water. So here the picture goes, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Maybe the way we should take that in terms of going, all of a sudden now there's clouds above and waters beneath. It's not yet a rain cycle or a water cycle kind of set up just yet. But to go, let's separate the waters above from the waters below. And so you realize, okay, this is a little bit different. And he makes a statement. He says, and let it separate the waters from the waters. Then he continues, verse 7. God made the expanse. Now, here in verse 7, here's our Hebrew word, Asah. God made. He formed. He shaped. Because remember, the waters were already on the planet. Now he's taking them and he's shaping them, and some of the waters are going to be above and some of the waters are going to be below. You see a difference here in terms of forming and shaping rather than a creation of something from nothing? That's kind of the distinction it's trying to make to us, just in the Hebrew language. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And then here is just one of my favorite little phrases through Genesis chapter 1. And it was so. God said it, and it was so. I don't know if you've ever kind of had situations like this happen, things that don't seem like they would make sense. Kind of like a mother telling her young son, go make up your bed. And it was so. And you go, oh, it actually happened. It happened the way it was supposed to happen. And to realize this is God saying, I want the waters to be separated from the ones above, from the ones below. and it was so. Now, I want you to consider this. What human eyes are there to see this? None. All of creation is hidden from the eyes of mankind. Every bit of it. So what God is giving Moses is something he had no other way to find out unless God himself was to share it with him. And so here you see the point of saying, and it was so. In other words, and that's the way it was. He said it, he made it, and that's the way it was. Verse 8, God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. Once again, what do we call the expanse in the skies? Do you call it the heavens? Sky? We get kind of these azure blue statements. And they go, here he is. He says, he called the expanse heaven. And he's going to use that term again here in a minute. He says, there was evening and there was morning a second day. So here we are. We have a separation on day one of light separated from darkness. Day two, we have a separation of the waters. Now there's some water that's above the planet Earth or around the planet Earth, the way we would probably think of it. And the waters below. On to day three, verse 9. Then God said, and once again, pay close attention to these statements that are within the quotation marks about what God says. Then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. Now, here's where the picture's starting to become a little bit more complete. He says, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place. And you go, all right, we have basically, I'm going to call it the seas, because that's what he's about to call it. It completely covers the globe. Water's been separated above the surface of the earth from that which is below. And now he says, now I want the waters that are below to gather into one. Now, I'm going to give you a little trick question here. If you study geography in schools, how many oceans are there? Y'all didn't do good in school then. Come up with 4. No, I'm just kidding. 7 seas. How many of them touch each other? All of them. Isn't that something? We try to say they're different, but they're really not. It's all one. It's just based upon geography, I know. But I just want you to kind of notice this thought. Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place. They're going to touch each other, right? Then, if you notice what he goes on to say, and it was so, he says, and let the dry land appear. So the water recedes and gathers, and what appears below it? Dry land. No, and notice it does make that distinction. It's not just land, it's actually dry land. It's not mud and marsh. Now, here's where he continues. Once again, you see kind of the naming of things as it goes through verse 10. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. Once again, terminology we're familiar with, even to this day? Certainly. Then, he says, and God saw that it was good. Now, if you look at day 1, light was good. If you look at day 2, God doesn't say anything was good. He doesn't even talk about it. But then you get here to day 3, and he divides, he gathers the waters and where they subside away from the dry land, and he says, and it was good. Everything is functioning the way God wants it to. That's what things are good, right? Do you remember whenever someone told Jesus, says, good teacher, what did he say? Don't call me good. There's only one who's good. There's only one who functions together well. Of course, Jesus is good because he's functioning together with him. But you see the distinction that Jesus makes in that of going, okay. He says, God saw that it was good. Now you have darkness and light have been separated. You have the waters above have been separated from the waters below. You see the waters gathered together on day 3 to expose dry land. And It was good, and it was so. Now, if you notice through these things together, look at how it continues. Now that it was good, verse 11. Then God said, oh, God's going to speak a second time on this day. So do you expect things to change? Certainly. So he makes another statement. He says in verse 11, then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seeds in them. And it was so. Now, I don't know how creative your mind is, but you think about all the different variations, and maybe you have to make a little distinction here about heirloom distinctions of things that are actually old, not man-made crossbred things. But going, how many could you think of to create that would be different in terms of fruits and vegetables? You know, maybe come up with 100, and you think, yet how many variations are there? Thousands, if not far, far more. And yet you notice here, he makes the statement, plants yielding seed. What difference would it have been if there weren't seeds? How long would it have lasted? Lasted one generation, right? It's one of those things when I was a kid, the idea of seedless watermelon seemed a little crazy to me. Because it made me wonder, is this the last one? Will we never get another one? But I understood it later. But I want you to notice the idea here. Plants yielding seed, fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. The last time you ate a vegetable or a fruit and you looked on the inside and saw seeds, did you ever think, God did that? Look at what God's done. It's not just for one generation. It's made to go forward, generation after generation after generation. Now, when you consider the thought here, you already know what's coming in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. When did God bring the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? When did he bring the tree of life? You notice where we're at. We got dry ground. We got moisture. This is where he makes all those trees and fruits and vegetables. Now, I don't know that you can exactly say that definitively, but you just notice this is where trees come in. This is where vegetation comes in. This is where fruit comes in. Then, of course, at the end of verse 11, and it was so. Verse 12. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. It functions together well. Everything is being laid out together. And then, of course, verse 13. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. Now, if you notice, here we are halfway through the creation week. Day 1, separation of light and darkness. Day 2, a separation of the waters. Waters above, hovering above the earth, as opposed to the waters that completely cover the earth. Day 3, a gathering of the waters together, the seas, to expose what would now become the dry land. As having dry land, now there's vegetation upon it. Now there's trees that are going to produce fruit and seed after them, vegetation that's going to have seed within them. And you look through this and you go, look at everything functioning together. Look at what God is doing. He makes a statement and it is so. Now I want you to just stop for a minute and think about the words of God that you know, the words of Jesus that you've heard. If God says it, what do you know? That's the way it is. I want you to think about the words of Jesus. How many times do you read about Jesus saying, Anyone who has ears to hear, let him hear. He says it several times. And if you notice, he's not saying things that are questionable. He's saying, this is the way it is. The only real question is, are you going to believe it or not? Now, and it's so. Then, you look through these first 3 days. If you notice on the sheet, you're going to notice that day 4 is going to correlate with day 1. You're going to notice that day 5 is going to correlate with day 2. And you're going to notice that day 6 is going to correlate with day 3. It's as if it was all planned from the beginning. Now, notice how we go through. We talked about before the plans that God had in place before the foundation of the world. I want you to notice some of these things that get brought up. Verse 14. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so.
Yeah, why did he create the light before the source of all light?
Well, I think you've forgotten something. Who is the source of the light?
Oh, he is, but still he created.
He is. He's the source.
Light and the darkness, and then later creates the sun and the moon.
Right. That's right. What's he saying? Who's in control here? He is. He is. Now, notice it here in verse 14. He says, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens. And this is where we start to think about sun, moon. We'll get to stars here in a minute. He says, to separate the day from the night. Now, has he already separated darkness and light? But now he's going to set things in motion to where now, notice what else are these things going to be there for? He mentions 4 things in particular. He says for signs, for seasons, for days, and years. Now, whenever you start looking at these things, I want you to kind of think back in your mind and go, has God ever used these things for signs? And you go, well, of course he has. And we'll deal with that a little bit more here in a minute. But notice what's really being set up here. Now we're getting beyond just planet Earth. He says, let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. So now you start to see the idea of sun. And if you notice it here, he's going to go a little bit further. He says to give light on the earth, and it was so. He says it, and it was so. Now, verse 16. Notice specifically, look for the word made. God made the 2 great lights, the great light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. Here's our word for made. This is that Asah word. Look at what he's doing. He's forming and shaping. You see him take these things together and put them in place. Were they in place before? No. Are they in place now? Why? Because he said so. Lynn. Well, we'll deal with that here in a little bit if we can get far enough. And if not, we'll deal with it next week. Chuck. What time? Yes. Right. It's sustaining because he said so. And now you get something alongside to go, okay, let's be able to turn this into seasons and years and days and for signs. And specifically, I want you to notice here in verse 16, and it just throws this out there like it is of little significance. And it says, and he made, and this is an inferred word, but it would be the word for Asah, to mold or to shape. He says, He made the stars also. As if just a bythought. And the next time you go out at night and look up and you see all these stars, and to go, just an afterthought, just a bunch of stars. Now, here's the other aspect I want you to think about this. Just as an estimation, in the Milky Way galaxy, there's over 100 billion stars. That's just in the Milky Way galaxy from what's been observed. Now, I'm going to have to read this because I'll mess it up if I don't. In the observable universe, there are 200 billion trillion stars. If you want to know what the real number is, it's over 200 sextillion stars. And if you're not familiar with math, that's a 2 followed by 23 zeros. And that's a conservative estimation. Some people think there might be 300 sextillion. Now, and by the way, that's just added as, and He made the stars also. Just as a little side thought. Now, remember what these things are for. Signs, seasons, days, years. What does God already have in mind? What's He going to use the stars as a sign for? Who's He going to use it to? He's going to talk to Abram. He's going to tell him, I'm going to make your descendants as many as the stars of the heavens. And as you think through that together, you go, look at what's in place here of going, whenever the Magi in Matthew chapter 2 come from the east, what are they following? A star. A bright star. And you realize, is God using that as a sign? Does God already have Jesus in mind, even in creation, as Jesus is there working together with Him as the Word? He's not in the flesh yet, but to see these things together, real quickly, look over at the book of Amos. Amos chapter 8. Look at verse 9. In the days of Amos, God is declaring that Israel will be destroyed, that Israel is going to have a judgment. And as part of that judgment, he brings up this prophecy. And remember, stars are for signs. It's day, night, all these things together. Amos chapter 8, look at verses 9 and 10. It will come about in that day, a day of judgment. He says, declares the Lord God, that I will make the sun go down at noon and make the earth dark in broad daylight. Then I will turn your festivals into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. And I will bring sackcloth on everyone's loins and baldness on every head. And I will make it like a time of mourning for an only son. And the end of it will be like a bitter day. And if you're already thinking about the crucifixion of Jesus, you're right on target. Because it is dark from noon until when? 3 p.m. Is it a festival time? It's the festival of Passover. And isn't it a mourning over an only son? Here's God's only son. And you realize, what was God using the light and the darkness for? It was a sign. Does anybody remember the words of Amos? He says, you're seeing it right here in front of you. And you go, here's God in creation, already looking over 4,000 years ahead of Jesus. Already setting things together among His own people. Now, come back over to Genesis chapter 1. So you notice how He grabs these things together. Formed, made the two great lights. The greater light to govern the day, we think of the sun. The lesser light to govern the night, the reflection the sun has off the moon. He says He made the stars also. Verse 17. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. Think about, now we're talking about what we would probably call outer space. the universe. He says he placed them. Can you imagine just picking them and placing them? The same way maybe you place dishes on the table. He's like, well, let me place the sun. Let me place the moon. Let me place all these stars. Yeah, I'll do that too. Then, notice how he continues. Verse 18, here's why. The purpose of these two lights. And to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Look at how everything functions together well. Then, he continues on, verse 19. He says, there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. So do you see a correlation between day 1 and day 4? Now let's take a step forward into day 5. Verse 20. Then God said, you notice how these statements get made. God speaks, and what happens? Whatever he says. It says, then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. He says, it's time to fill these waters full of living creatures. And it's time to fill the sky with what? With birds. You remember what day 2 of creation was? We're going to separate the waters below from the waters above. And what does he fill? The birds with the in-between and living creatures or fish in the waters. But as well as something else here. Notice how he continues. Verse 21. God created. There's that Bara. To form something out of nothing. God created the great sea monsters. Doesn't that have your imagination going wild? And every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Now, once again, these things are all looking forward. Hold on to this thought. God created the great sea monsters. Look over at Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, look down at verse 38. See what God's already looking forward to. Matthew chapter 12, verse 38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees said to Jesus, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. Do one of those fancy signs for us. We came here for the show. Verse 39. But Jesus answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet. What is he talking about? Verse 40. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster. Notice it doesn't say whale. The sea monster. Jonah was in the belly of the sea monster for 3 days and 3 nights. Yeah, a great fish. He says, and behold, he says, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So the sign of Jonah is about resurrection. So when God's creating, forming the sea monsters, what is he already looking forward to? The resurrection of Jesus. Putting things in place. So that whenever Jonah comes, he's going to be swallowed by a sea monster, going to be spit out 3 days later. And then he says, this is the sign that I'm going to give you. He says, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. Whenever you see me raised from the dead, then you'll know. If you have any faith whatsoever. Remember, the things about Jesus were in place, foreknown before the foundation of the world. And here these things are already laid out for what's coming later. Stars in the heavens, descendants like that. Think of stars for signs, like the star that the Magi followed. Here's sea monsters, just like to remind them, like the sign of Jonah. Jesus can be raised from the dead after 3 days and 3 nights. Come back to Genesis. So here in verse 21, God created Bara, the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Verse 22. The first blessing. If we get far enough, we'll get to see 2 of these. He says, God blessed them. Who's them? The birds and the fish, the creatures, the sea monsters. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. Who would want to try and count the fish in the sea? Who would want to try and count the birds in the sky? I can't even count the birds in my backyard. Now, you realize the thoughts here. Did they do what God told them to do? Fruitful and multiply. That's exactly what they did. God blessed them. And look at their blessing. Then, verse 23, there was evening and there was morning, a 5th day. So there's the conclusion to day 5. And I hope you understand how day 5 correlates with day 2. These things are going just like what we would expect, but what do we know to expect? But you just see that there's order to this. If you remember, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He says, and the earth was formless, it was chaotic, and it was void, it was empty. What are you starting to see God do? He's giving things order and setting them with purpose. He is filling the earth. It's no longer void. He is completely changing everything about the heavens and the earth. Notice how this continues. Day 6, verse 24. Then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. Now, if you remember on day 3, it's about the dry land appears. Now what's he doing? Yeah, let's put cattle there. He says, let's put these beasts of the earth there. He says, these creeping things. Some people go, oh, why the creeping things? But he puts them there, he puts them in place, and it was so. Verse 25. God made, there's our word for formed, shaped. There's our Asah again. He says, God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. It's all functioning together very well. Look at the goodness. Now, then we get to the next aspect, verse 26. Continuing in day 6. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Now, if you're a Hebrew in the wilderness and you hear that, who is us and our? No, you don't know about Jesus yet if you're in the wilderness. The Spirit. Remember the Spirit that was over the surface of the waters? Whenever they heard us and our, they thought God the Father and the Spirit. They didn't know about who yet. Who do we know about, though? So we know who the us is, something they didn't know. Then he says, let us make man in our image. And to think in terms of God and his image. Does God have a soul? Yes. Does God have an eternal body? Not a physical body, I'm not saying that. An eternal body. Yes. Does God have a spirit? Yes. You think about us being made in his image? Do we have a soul? Do we have a body? Yes. Do we have a spirit? Yes, because whenever that spirit leaves, what happens to the body? It dies. We know that from James. So, he says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. And here's also a part of that likeness and that image. And let him do what? Let him rule. Let him have dominion. Does God have dominion? If we haven't seen that, he has dominion over heaven, earth, creatures, everything in between, the celestial bodies. Take your pick. He has rule and control. He says, let's give those who are made in our image and our likeness, let's let them rule over fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. If you want to go over to Genesis 9 in your own time, you'll understand this a little bit differently. At this point in time, when man is made, the animals are not afraid of them. It's completely different. Now, real quickly, before time runs out, let's keep going. Then, notice verse 27. Notice it's there 3 times. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. All 3 times, Bara. What point is God trying to make? I made you. I created you. I didn't just form you. I created you. And I created you in my image, and it doesn't matter whether you're a male or a female as to whether you're made in my image. Now, if you see what's at hand here, verse 28, notice what comes next. A blessing. Here's the second blessing in the creation week. He says, God blessed them, and God said to them. Oh, God is speaking directly to who? Man and woman. Now, we're going to get some more details on this story in chapter 2, but he says he speaks directly to them. And he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, dominate it. He says, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. He says, I have put you in control. He says, you subdue it. That's your role. You're made in my image. Then, verse 29. He says, then God said, he speaks again, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. So from day 6 of creation, tell me what the eating habits of mankind and animals are. Vegetarian across the board. No meat eaters. And it was so. Now, I know that sounds really different. When you get to Genesis 9, that's when it's going to change. So just know that. After the flood, you're going to see that change come about. Here's the point. Verse 31. God saw all that he had made, all that he had formed and shaped. There's that Asah word. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now that it's complete, everything is functioning together just the way that it should. And of course, it's going to leave this very good when we get to Genesis chapter 3. But notice here, he says, behold, it was very good, and there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. Now, real quickly, let's answer Lynn's question. What about these days? How does this fit with time? Look over at Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. Look down at verse 8. Fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Verse 10. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. Here's why. Verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. I want you to think about this. People want to argue day and night about, well, are these 24-hour days or are they just these eons of time? Well, look at what God just told them. He says God made it in 6 days, and after the 6th day, there's supposed to be a 7th day of rest. If these aren't 24-hour days, it makes it really hard to celebrate the Sabbath, doesn't it? After 6 eons of time, of which we don't know how long they are, then celebrate a rest for a 7th eon of time that we don't know how long it is. Right? It has to be 24-hour days, doesn't it? And you see what God has set up and initiated. And all of a sudden you start looking through these things and go, God's answered the questions if we're ready to listen. He said it's so. And you go, well, that's what God said. So guess what we're to understand? to see it that way. If you think in these terms about, has chaos been changed into order? It's very good. Has what is void and empty now been filled? Yes. What a difference 6 days makes with God. Now, next week we'll come back and we'll get to dive in a little bit more into some of these things. All right, thank you.
Though they are slighting him, still he is waiting, waiting the penitent child to receive. Plead with them earnestly, plead with them gently. He will forgive if they truly believe. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Down in the human heart, crushed by the tempter, feelings lie buried that grace can restore. Touched by a loving hand, wakened by kindness, chords that were broken will vibrate once more. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Rescue the perishing, duty demands it. Strength for thy labor the Lord will provide. Back to the narrow way, patiently win them. Tell the poor wanderer a Savior has died. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Tis the blessed hour of prayer, when our hearts slowly bend, and we gather to Jesus, our Savior and friend. If we come to Him in faith, His protection to share, what a balm for the weary. golden shore where the faithful barks go o'er, when the storm